In 1783, George Washington stood at the height of his power. He commanded the army that had defeated the British. His soldiers were loyal to him. Many expected him to remain the dominant figure in the new nation. Some even suggested he could become king. Instead, Washington did something almost unimaginable to that point in history. He resigned. He surrendered his military authority and returned home. He demonstrated that power and authority are not the same thing. Power is the ability to act. Authority is the recognized right to act, and legitimacy is what convinces everyone else to accept the decision. Welcome to Understandable Insights, Information to Intelligence with Sue Gordon, the national security podcast that gives you a competitive advantage, an elemental understanding of the world as it is, not how you prefer it to be. I'm Eric, joined each week by the Honorable Sue Gordon, and together we'll break down the headlines shaping our world, looking for patterns and early warning signs, and asking how we should be thinking and acting as citizens and leaders across issues in intelligence, technology, and business. It's June 22nd, 2026. Let's get to it. Hey, Sue, how are you?
I was going to say good morning, Eric, but we're recording afternoon today. So good afternoon, Eric.
Good afternoon.
I'm good. Fighting the fight.
Yeah, we've been busy. Folks who listen to us regularly know that we missed a week just because we had a lot of stuff going on. And so we have recognized that it's time to focus on the podcast. We're going to take a little bit of time away from our production and look to join back up probably at the end of the summer. We're targeting right around Labor Day, right?
Yeah, we're really proud of now. This is our 47th episode in a year, almost exactly. And I think if you subtract 47 from 52, that's how few we've missed. But I think it's just a great time for us to sit back, think about, are we having the impact we want? Are there other things we want to do? We've talked about guests forever. I'd love to line up some guests. I'd love to line up some live events. I think it's a great time because this is really is it the fourth or the fifth in a series that we had about asking better questions and trying to get citizens prepared. So great time. And there's nothing more than that when we take the time off. No, my health is not well, my health may have deteriorated, but that's not the reason. And no, we're not losing Eric. We just got to get our act together a bit.
And we want to continue doing this at a high level, right?
Yeah.
We're both very proud of our work to this point. And jumping back in at the beginning of September, it's a fun time of year with some election season.
Yep. And this is a great time for any of your thoughts. I think we've gotten great feedback that you like our Better Questions series. Elections coming up, what would be helpful? So we're not going away. We're just going to think a bit and come back better.
That's right. So what are we talking about today?
So today, I found myself looking at three completely different stories, Iran and elections in the courts. There's a lot going on each of those. The news is just so full. And I thought about, even though they seem unrelated, one's about war, one's about voting, one's about judges, I think they're all asking the same question: who gets to decide? Who gets to decide whether America uses force? Who gets to decide how elections are run? Who gets to decide whether government actions are legal? And perhaps most importantly, who gets to decide whether those decisions are legitimate? I think you and I would both agree, Eric, that there are a lot of decisions being made in different places, and increasingly, whether it is the political factions or it is just the kind of disquiet, I think there's a real question about whether those decisions are legitimate. Because in a democracy, and as your cold open proved, authority isn't enough. People have to believe that authority was exercised properly. And so today we're going to use these three stories to explore one question: who gets to decide? Looking at three different forms of authority, whether that is executive authority that we can see through Iran, or election authority that is distributed authority, and courts that are legitimizing authority. And we might get to the through line in all of that is, what the heck is Congress doing? Because what's so interesting to me in this really fast-moving time is that the branch that seems to be the most unsure about how it gets into the fray, as our founders envisioned, is Congress. So hopefully we'll talk about all those things as we go through it.
All right. Let's get to it. On June 15th, the U.S. and Iran signed a preliminary memorandum of understanding, MOU, a 60-day ceasefire framework that includes reopening the Strait of Hormuz and the beginning of nuclear negotiations. Most coverage is asking whether this is a good deal. We're going to instead ask a slightly different question. Who has the authority to make said deal? The Constitution splits war and peace between two branches. The President commands, Congress authorizes, but the House already passed a War Powers Resolution 215 to 208, and the Senate won't touch it. And the administration argues that the War Powers Act deadline doesn't apply because hostilities have, quote, terminated. Meanwhile, lawmakers are invoking the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act, the same law from 2015, to argue this MOU should go to Congress for review. So you spent decades watching presidents of both parties stretch and expand executive authority and privilege. Is what we're seeing now different in kind or different in degree?
I think both. You know, I was going to say that, though, Eric. You said it exactly right. It feels like it's all right now just happening with this administration, and people are shaking their fists to the cosmos. And depending on which side of the aisle you're on, there's a lot of fist shaking.
Right.
But I think, to me, this has been going on at least since 9/11, so at least 20 years. And I infer from that, when I look at it, I think that what has changed is the speed and the volume of the things that are trying to be done, that are being addressed. I cannot remember a time in my history when we have, I don't know, deposed the leader, shot boats out of the water, ignored Ukraine, pissed off all our adversaries, launched tariffs, started a war in Iran, now trying to end it. I mean, just the number of things that are going on is certainly an escalation of one kind that we're feeling now. But remember, right after 9/11, the president didn't wait with the actions that he took to immediately get us going and attacking people as we thought was appropriate. So I don't think it's new. I think it's an artifact of how fast the world is turning, how impatient leaders are getting, how much information is available. And it's all allowed because they have justified their speed because of the urgency of decision. But the founders set up a system that was purposely deliberative. So, in a weird sort of way, yes, the world is demanding faster and more, but our willingness to take on all those things without deliberation, regardless of the second and third order effects, I think, is creating some of it. I don't think it's new. I think it's a trend that's driven by how connected the world is, how many things can be presented to us at once that seem to need decisions. But this idea that just because it has to happen, it can happen badly is not serving us well anymore. You know, the founders deliberately created tension in our system. And while you and I have talked about this, I certainly think that the government is not keeping up with the turn of the world. That doesn't mean we should throw out all our processes just to be able to do everything we want to do. So it's been going this way. I think it started environmentally, and now it's almost come into a test of wills. Like, I have the position, the people elected me, so I should be able to do it. I don't know,
Yeah,
what
the
do you
mandate.
Yeah. But again, we started doing this after 9/11 because we were a nation under attack. We had terrorists coming after us, and you started seeing the Patriot Act and lots of questions about what you had the right to do, or then whose phones could we seize, and just a whole number of things have started cascading as the world became more challenging and our systems weren't keeping up. So we decided we couldn't wait for the systems. And now we're seeing the artifact of that, where we're making decisions before they've been properly tested as the founders envisioned. And Iran is just a great case of it, right? The commander-in-chief certainly can identify a situation and command something to happen, but Congress is the ones that declares war, the president can move quickly, but the Congress provides the democratic authorization and oversight. As we said, that's not a flaw, it's design. And so I think missiles certainly don't wait for committee hearings, cyber attacks don't pause for floor votes. So presidents of both parties have steadily accumulated operational authority because look what's happening, something needs to be done, and our system was too slow. And I think Congress has accepted that shift until moments like this happened, where now you're saying we've kind of, as a nation, moved on from this deliberative process, but then think about Iran. I'm not sure the nation agrees or everyone in Congress agrees that there was any urgency that made us act without deliberation. And so that's where all this has taken us, and Iran is a great example. Congress trying to catch up, and I know that's good, but decisions continue to be made. The idea that, do you know what's in the Iran agreement today? Did anyone decide that we should or shouldn't? I don't know. When we started, we were going to change the regime, but now we like the regime so much that we think it's only fair that they have ballistic missiles, and there's no conversation. So you asked me the simple question, and now I've rambled on, and the answer is this has been building. We've been allowing it. We've been allowing it in peace parts. And now all of a sudden, we have a whole war that no one believes had to happen. We were not attacked in this case. It was a preemptive war that hasn't been explained, that had unintended consequence, that is completely driven by executive authority. And you see the Congress struggling to catch up, but it's hard. And I think history will not be kind to us on how this went.
Yeah, the executive authority certainly expanded post 9/11, right? I think you could probably trace it back to President Jackson, but that's a different podcast for a different time. But you're right, the Congress then caught up. You mentioned earlier the Patriot Act and the FISA, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But is that what makes this period different? Is that Congress isn't catching up? What does that catch up look like? Are they just validating that use of executive authority? Are they formalizing it and codifying it by putting it into legislation? Or is that their opportunity to say, no, we didn't like this, we're not doing that again?
You and I both agreed that for decades, and nice mention of Jackson, before that, power has flowed toward the executive branch because speed has become strategic advantage. So really natural process of evolution of the world, speed's flowing to it. Yes, Congress is catching up, but they're catching up in arrears. They're catching up, and they're going to decide whether the president has to stop the war. Good conversation. We're in the middle of peace negotiations. So even though they're catching up, they're almost still irrelevant because it's meant to happen at the point of decision. This whole podcast is about who gets to decide. And what we're missing is the tension on that decision. So yay, Congress, for finally getting into the act. But let's say that they decide that he doesn't have the authority or they limit his authorities. What relevance does that have now? So yay, Congress, but you aren't doing enough. The only way this works, and it's not just up to Congress, right? It's up to the leader to say, I believe that I need that tension. I believe in that check and balance. I want to do this, so I'm going to put the effort into having the dialogue. And you and I have talked about it on so many issues. I live in fear of China deciding that today's the day they want to go after Taiwan. And we've had no national conversations about how important that is to us and what our national interests are and how to constrain it. So imagine if that decision happens, which is wholly in Xi's head. We have basically no ability, in my estimation, because we haven't exercised it along the way to say, let's figure out how we get that deliberative process to be faster. And this is a pipe dream, I would hope, more apolitical. Because don't you think that one of the things that has slowed down the effectiveness of the deliberation is straight party line votes?
100%. Yeah.
It doesn't matter, right? Whoever has power is going to do it, both sides, and it's all about the vote. I'm talking about Iran, but we could be talking about the domestic issues. Because ultimately, we never had the discussion about DHS and ICE. What we did is we got to the point where we could use the budget process to fund it anyway without the benefit of the deliberation. So Iran seems to be resolving. Congress is having conversations. Someone said, don't look at the outcome all the time. This is funny for me to say because I talk about outcomes. The process matters. The process matters too, right? Did you run the play right? Did you do the right things? We have done none of the things right in terms of deliberation and legitimacy of our decision-making process on the war. It will resolve somehow. There will be people claiming victory or defeat on both sides, but we never did what we needed to do. And so we're not exercising deliberation at speed. One of the things that we talk about is how do we ask better questions, because just because someone can act doesn't automatically answer whether they should act alone. So maybe the questions that ought to be asked when we come back and of the elected officials is not do you support military action, but ask what authority is being used, what oversight exists to do it, what role should Congress play, what precedent is being established, and if another president used the same authority, would we be comfortable with it? And so I think for as much as I talk about outcome, I think this is in fact one where our processes are broken, and so consequently our outcomes at best will be not harmful, but at worst will always be considered by some fraction to be illegitimate, and that just erodes trust in our system. Actions create precedent, and precedent is the payload for further action, and so it just kind of tumbles, and if you never catch up with the legitimacy piece, I don't know how you get that back in play. We have an election coming up in, as you eloquently said, 5 months now? There are a lot of questions that need to be asked, and our citizens are the ones that should be asking, and we hope we arm you with those. And as far as what's going on with Iran, I don't know. Do you?
I just want to comment on all your military strike puns. We're going to arm you and the
Yeah.
payload. And were those intentional? Yeah.
I'm here for you. Well, we're talking about a war, so it's okay. But I do think this notion of actions do become precedent, whether they are deliberatively arrived at or not. And the minute that action happens, it is considered precedent for something else. If you watch the nightly news, you hear all the whataboutism, right? What about when so and so did what? And you're right, but we've got to get this under control. And I think all the things that are going on with data analytics can help us. We can look more data, but ultimately it comes down to decision and belief that the tension in our system was there by design. And if it can be affected in a reasonable time frame in the environment that exists, then it ought to be used. And if it is no longer something that we can use in this world, we better come up with another way to put that tension into the system, because we are just a flywheel spinning.
Yep. But we do have those elections on the horizon.
Yep.
And if Iran is a story about centralized authority, elections are the opposite. We've talked about this before. America doesn't have an election system. It has thousands. Counties administer, states set rules, courts resolve disputes, and Congress certifies. That distribution is deliberate, but right now, Congress is debating the Save America Act, which would require documentary proof of citizenship to register to vote in federal elections. It passed the House in February and is in Senate committee. At the same time, the president demanded that the SAVE Act be tied to FISA Section 702 reauthorization, a national security surveillance tool. And when Congress resisted, the president pulled his own DNI nominee's confirmation hearing as leverage. So a voting bill, a surveillance tool, and an intelligence appointment all got tangled together. But that's not a story about elections. That's a story about where authority actually lives and who's driving. The SAVE Act would impose federal proof of citizenship requirements on a system that's been run locally for 250 years. Regardless of whether you think that's good policy, what does it tell us about the direction authority is flowing?
I think this is actually one of the most disturbing trends, because the distributed nature of our elections was precisely believed in and specifically addressed in the Constitution. And the reason is to make sure as we are, as everyone who anytime I say democracy, I get emails that say we're not a democracy. That's right, we're a representative republic. And the idea is that distributed elections would preserve this idea of the people's vote. by breaking up, give them the authority, the manner in which they conduct the elections, have them come together. And so that is one of the most brilliant, beautiful things about our nation. And we're messing with it, right? And we're much like the previous segment when we talked about sucking authority up in the name of I need to have control, I need to be able to assure, I need to be able to mandate, I need to be able to believe. We're sucking authority up rather than strengthening the elements of the system. I've heard the claims. I reject the notion that our elections do not involve the right people without the amount of fraud that would make a consequential difference, and are the best way for us to ensure that we preserve our founders' ideals and not reside all the power in one person. And again, let's talk about Congress as a through line here, and that is it needs to be debated. What the president is relying on is the simplistic statement of, isn't it right that we make sure that everyone who votes in the elections is legitimate? But the truth is, this has been studied over and over and over and over and over and over again, and it is legitimate. It has produced legitimate results. Not results that don't have errors, but don't have errors anywhere near the magnitude that would say it's just a mess. When we take our elections and we say, no, I'm going to control them nationally, that is a half a step away from someone who just wants to dictate the outcome, much like authoritarian regimes do. And so this idea of creating hardship as an excuse to be able to exercise more control, if you squint and look at what's going on in Iran, you can see the folly of that approach. So again, not wrong of the president to want to put something in place that makes our most sacred process secure, but it's being done in a way that wrests authority from the state in a way that was never imagined that would happen. So the arguments sound rational, but I don't think that we will get what we want out of it. So I'm a big local authority girl on the elections. And can I digress for a second about FISA Section 702 that gives the government the ability to collect against foreign actors known or suspected to be doing things against the United States and collect on them overseas. But we have now tied that with the Save America Act and the withdrawal of the DNI nomination and leaving Bill Pulte in place. This feels like a great opportunity to create a national security reason why we have to nationalize our elections. That you can construct an argument, whether it is true or not, that in order to protect us from foreign invaders, 702, to ensure that we get the right documentation of anyone who's voting, and an acting DNI that has no experience and is known to be a loyalist who has the ability to act for 210 days, which goes to the election. I think you're seeing now an intersection between coming up with a national security reason why the elections have to be centrally controlled. And I think it's antithetical to who we are as a nation, and using national security as a reason why you have to do that, I think is tough.
I don't know. That sounds a lot like 4D chess, though. That's some long-term vision.
Yeah, maybe not, but
That's 3 or 4 steps at least.
Yeah, and you know what? I have said I do not see that as a forte of this administration, but I think the withdrawal of the DNI nominee, who may not have been my favorite, but was one who would have to be confirmed, that creates the oversight. You now put an acting that has no constraints.
Yeah.
And you had, even before that happened, you saw the specter of national security coming into elections when Director Gabbard was there in Georgia, where she would have no particular role.
Right.
And then you have Save America Act that he has tied to that nominee. My gosh, I've turned into who I don't want to talk about outcome now. I want to talk about process.
I was going to say, the way you're laying it out, it makes a lot of sense, but
I think I'm willing to put on my tinfoil hat, or at least consider the possibility, because I think we're messing with the most sacred thing that we have.
Sure.
And we're doing it at a time that in many domains we're saying we don't have time right? We don't have time. We don't have time to run the process. We're going to talk about the courts in a minute. The courts, I think, are holding the line pretty well, but you can go out of national security entirely and go into immigration. You're saying, "I'm sorry, I just don't have time. I've got so many people here. I've got to get them out. I don't have time to run the process of having a court hearing." So what started as a real problem with a real system that was slower than the time and the environment demands has now spun to it's an excuse to do everything as fast as you want. And while I will continue to say I have no idea, and I try never to say what's in someone's head, this does feel like it's moving for this administration. And I do know this president who wants what he wants. And so all these things are conspiring, but touching our elections, man, I think back to the better questions thread,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what would you ask?
I would say, who actually runs the elections where I live? What authorities belong to the states? Just don't assume that it's something. The Constitution is really clear on these authorities, super clear. And I've said this before, the founders were not casual about the language they used. They understood the difference between people here and citizens. Right? So when they said there was a census to count the people, they meant that we needed to count all the people so that we could account for them and provide for them and make sure there were resources to cover them. They could have said citizens. They did not. Well, elections are another one that says very clearly that states determine the manner in which elections are conducted. So ask the questions about, is the authority that belongs to the state being abrogated? And what authorities belong to the president? National security has historically been used and seen by the courts, by the way, as sacrosanct and demanding less proof that it actually is a national security crisis and just accepting that it'll go along. And I just ask the questions about that. What authority? What urgency to change it? Where does the decision-making reside? What role can the courts play? And how are disputes resolved? My big worry about elections is that the courts do resolve issues. They are, for our system, almost a preserver of legitimacy, but the timing is way off. How long it takes a court to decide and act, because they do still rely on process profoundly. If we think the courts are going to be the ones that establish the legitimacy in a nation right now that has a significant fraction of the population that believe that we have already had an illegitimate election, and claims are made and the courts are too slow, I think they can lose relevance in the same way that Congress has. I think the courts decided that the president couldn't build his ballroom, right?
Yes.
When you hear him talk, is he building his ballroom?
Yes.
So my worry about this press, and I think elections are a really important crucible for all the things we're talking about. Because if we lose it here, if we don't maintain that distributed authority that the founders envisioned for the very specific purpose of maintaining a representative republic, I don't know where the bulwark is to just rolling on through. And I would love to stop and, reimagine how in 2026, how we might rewrite the Constitution with all the things we know. Don't have time for that. It is a good framework. Let's not be so urgent that we don't use that very fundamentally American disagreement and dialogue as a way to resolve things, rather than just put our thumb on the scale to get it because we have to have it. Do you think I missed more on that other than my 40 chess on the DNI move? I think I'm right on that.
Makes sense to me.
I think he counted the days and he said, "Oh, he doesn't have to be confirmed. We can just move on through the elections." And I'm picking on this administration because they have power right now, and this is all happening for them right now.
Yeah, and hopefully we're still doing this and criticizing President Newsom or President Rubio in the same way. Right?
100%. I think that's one of my greatest fears, is that when I use a name, that people think that I am a priori against that. No, I don't like the things that from our perspective, and you and I come at it with the benefit of having been inside the system to both live in a very particular way the intention, see up close and personal the deficiencies of our system, but now recognize what's moving along. And so, like I said, we use a name, but more it's look at the action. Look at the action, see if it's in the direction we want to go.
Yep. You're spot on that the court can't establish precedent or can't establish that legitimacy. They just have to validate that
Right.
legitimacy. And
Right.
so let's talk about that institution a little bit. Supreme Court is in its final weeks of the term, and the remaining cases go directly at executive power. Got birthright citizenship, the president's authority over independent agencies, and regulatory enforcement. Every ruling will generate the same pattern. One side celebrates and waves their fists, the other attacks the court and waves their fists. See, the courts are fascinating because they almost have no enforcement power of their own. Their authority depends entirely on everyone else agreeing to accept that decision or validate that legitimacy. So, how's that looking these days?
The courts are trying, they're doing their job, they're rendering decisions, and interestingly enough, they kind of render decisions across the board, so you can't sit on one side or the other and feel like you always win or always lose, because if you look at them, there have been a number of decisions that have gone in favor of the administration, which represents a particular set of policies, but there have been a number of things that have gone against them as well. I would say that we tend to poo-poo court decisions based on process errors. Remember, that's part of legitimacy, right? So even if they don't take up a decision based on a process error, it's still a legitimate decision. My problem is they're rendering decisions slowly, perhaps, but they are still functioning, but they're just stacking up, and it's still who's going to be the enforcer? Is it the Justice Department? The Justice Department is a plaintiff in half the cases in most of these things. And if the government loses and the government doesn't care to lose, who's there to enforce it? Here's the good news. I do think that the American people, the people that listen to us, and actually we have lots of people overseas listening to us as well.
Mm-hmm.
I think they're starting to see the breakage, right? They're starting to see that there are court cases, decisions piling up that would have precluded something, but that something is still going on. What I think the courts have done very well, and the fact that it's still sitting out there, even if it's not enforced, is increasingly American people, I think, are seeing that we are doing things in a way that are not sustainable, or if they are sustained, are not in the direction of goodness. And so you see more activism, more podcasters, more demonstrations, more pressure put on state and local legislators about the decisions. So I think one of the things that the courts have done, even if it's slowly, even if it's not always enforced, is I think they have created enough questions, uncertainty about legitimacy that it'll let people get back into the process to be able to make some of the decisions in terms of who they vote for, who they put in office that will help. So I just remind, we talk about this all the time. Don't worry about disagreement between the executive branch and the courts. That happens all the time. Just that disagreement is part of our system. The signal that you need to worry about is this growing willingness to dismiss decisions as illegitimate whenever they produce outcomes we dislike. And as we talked in the other two segments, this is just a dangerous cycle, especially because of the role courts play. And if the courts lose legitimacy, disputes don't disappear, they simply move elsewhere, and usually into politics. And you can see that's happening right now. And if politics won't do it, then it can move into the streets. I think the courts, like any other of our institutions, are falling prey to speed and volume. And that difficulty again shifts power upwards. And I don't like using the word, king or autocrat here, but boy, if you concentrate all the power effectively or just by vagary of the outcome, you will end up in a place that is not what we intended, and people will lose power, and the disagreement in our system will go away, and people will stop believing, and we will have a very different nation. So this is a really good time for people to get engaged because the courts are holding barely. I think as you look at the decisions that come out of the courts, ask what authority is the court exercising? What constitutional question, remember that's what they're doing, is being resolved?
Uh-huh.
What standard is being applied? What precedent is being established? I really think this is a big episode about what precedent enables. And then I think the big question for the nation writ large, across all the segments we've talked about today, is what happens if citizens stop accepting the legitimacy of the process? That's it. What happens? The 2020 election has been asserted to be illegitimate. So far, we had another election, and we've maintained our integrity as a nation, at least at some level. Wow, what happens if 2026 midterm or 2028 presidential election isn't considered legitimate again? What happens? That'd be a great question for the person that you elect in your locality. What are you going to do to ensure the legitimacy and the effectiveness of our process? So I think our big message is it's become this kind of decision without process is really creating legitimacy as a strategic risk for us. This is a really critical moment across all the branches of our government and what we're allowing to happen in the name of we can't stop it. Yes, we can.
Well, is that what you want folks to walk away from this episode knowing or not
Yeah,
misunderstand?
I think that's right. I think this week's episode, what we talked about between Iran and the elections, what the courts are doing, and then the through line of Congress being somehow unable to catch up to the moment, it was evidence. Authority is the formal question we ask, power is the practical question we ask, and permission is the human question we ask. And in a democracy, almost nobody gets to act simply because they can. They act because we've collectively agreed that they may. And that distinction is the whole ballgame. It ties into what we've talked about with great rewiring. Yes, we might need to do some things differently, but we cannot want an outcome so badly that we ignore the process, because when you do that, you're just speeding towards something you don't want. So speed rewards action, and legitimacy requires consent. And we are not practicing the consent. So if the people who listen to us will demand more when someone wants their authority, I think we can pull her back.
Nice. Well, what else are you watching this week?
Actually, one thing I'm watching this week is the release of documents about the Anthony Fauci's interactions with the intelligence community during COVID. I'm leaving the Washington Post article on Director Gabbard aside. I will say, depending on where you get your news, this is either proof of a massive conspiracy or proof of nothing at all. I think both kind of miss the question. I'm a little bit on the nothing at all. But if you'll allow just a minute of personal privilege to talk about intelligence. Of course, intelligence officers talk to Anthony Fauci. You would want them to. They're trying to understand what he knows. He is an expert. Collaboration with experts is something to do. Moreover, there was a big national question about where the virus came from. Actually, if the intelligence community had not talked to Anthony Fauci, I'd be worried. You'd expect analysts to seek out the nation's leading infectious disease experts. That's their job. The better question,
Hey-o.
isn't did they talk? It's how do we know the intelligence remained independent? And people often confuse consultation with control. Experts certainly inform intelligence. They don't direct it. Analysts challenge experts, compare competing views, document dissent, and ultimately own their judgments. That's what analytic tradecraft is designed to do. If someone believes the process was corrupted, the burden isn't to show there were meetings. That's what those documents show to me. The burden is to identify the mechanism.
Mhm.
Who had the authority? What was being used? What was the incentive? What in the world? Dr. Anthony Fauci had no power over the intelligence community. They would want to hear his opinion, but he didn't have the ability to drive them to do something. So I just don't just say, aha, their documents, or aha, they met. I'm telling you, it would be weirder if they haven't. But then ask, what would be the incentive to be corrupt? What would be the incentive for the intelligence community to produce a storyline that wasn't theirs? Even in something that is often cited, like the decision to invade Iraq because they had WMD, which was a bad intelligence assessment. Do you know one of the reasons why they did it is because the intelligence community was in disagreement and they never came to any sort of resolution. So then you fall to the policymaker who could pick and choose. So
Hmm.
you want a strong intelligence process. Just because they come to a conclusion does not mean that it was politicized. So just settle down a little bit on this. I didn't see anything in those documents that was out of the ordinary in terms of the evidence. Some of the conclusions that are wrapped around that just seem unbelievable to me because I cannot figure out what the incentive or the mechanism would be for some nefarious engagement to happen between the intelligence community and Dr. Fauci just because they talked. So just remember, consultation is not control. And kind of what we're trying to do in the whole episode is to say, before concluding that authority has been abused, ask who had the authority to act, what process that governed the authority, and what evidence shows that the process either failed or worked, and you'll be better off. What do you have?
Saw today that Alan Greenspan,
Yeah,
longtime Federal Reserve Chairman, passed away at the age
yeah.
of 100. Unprecedented to be the Fed chair from 1987 to 2006, almost 20 years. So one of the first Fed chair that I remember, and saw over the Great Moderation, 18-year period, as they called it.
Yep.
Some critiques as, we led into the 2008 housing crisis, that some of the decisions may have led to some of that bubble, but certainly a long-standing tenure and legacy.
Yeah, I love that. And I absolutely one of those names that was a fixture into his family and friends. I don't care what age you reach, you miss somebody who leaves. What you just described is a really nice encapsulation of this whole episode, and that is there's nothing in the Constitution that says all the decisions made have to be right. What is in the Constitution is roles, responsibilities that are always in tension to ensure that we have the discussion that gives us the best chance of good outcome. And we've seen more recently this year a lot of question over what happens if the Fed becomes just an arm of the executive branch rather than it being independent. And so it was kind of funny as you were talking about Greenspan and saying some would disagree with the decisions. That's not what we should be looking at as a nation, as much as we're saying, yeah, but he carried out his role, and he carried out his role within the system that allowed our monetary policy to be independent and all the elements of the government to have a say. It didn't ensure that it was right all the time.
Yep. Well, that's what we're watching and how we see it. Thank you for joining us. No doubt there's more to come. This country's strength isn't in its power, industry, or government, but in its people.
So we have loved doing the first 47 episodes. There will be more. We appreciate you joining us each week, listening, laughing, shaking your fists at us periodically. We promise we'll come back after Labor Day. So until then, send your cards and letters. We're grateful for you. And we'll be back in the same bat channel at the same bat time, probably. But until then, please go forth, do good. And for goodness sakes, be kind to one another, because it's a world that really needs it. Thanks for listening.